All right, good afternoon, everybody. We are going to get started. I think we still got people trickling in, but I don't want to let our time slip away because we've got a big topic today. Sitecore JSS in action, brought to you by Paragon. My name is John Hours. I'm the CEO of Paragon, also an architect, spent a lot of time with Sitecore here and there on our customer projects and various R&D projects. And I want to go down this road with you guys today because JSS is a product we're fairly excited about and starting to see a lot of applications for headless in the market. So hopefully we can get everybody a little bit smarter about it. This is a big topic, and unfortunately, as we put this together, we had to back up a little bit and really set the groundwork for what JSS is and why we might use headless arrangement and so on. So I know we got a lot of developers on here. I'm going to try to get as technical as we can and show as much of it as we can. In the time we have. I think we're going to have to leave some features out as we go. So this may become the first in a series, but hopefully it'll be enough to wet your whistle and let you see what it is and what we're thinking about using it for and what you might think about using it for. Really encouraged to see that a lot of folks on this call today are developers, are technical people, because I do have source code to show today. Hopefully those of you who are listening have some experience on the front end dev side of things. But I think the back-end devs are going to benefit as well. So with that said, let's jump right in and take a look at the presentation for today. So the concept we're dealing with today, when we talk about JSS, we're talking about headless CMS. And headless CMS, you can conjure up a lot of bad images in your mind, right? The image I want you to have, though, is as a CMS with just the presentation part chopped off the front of it. And those of you who've been in Sitecore for a while know that we've gone through a number of different rendering options with Sitecore over the years, from XSLT options through web forms options and MVC options. And at this point, we talk about a headless implementation of Sitecore. We're simply just going to chop that off, and we're going to start right back on the we're going to start right back at the core and use the CMS for what we might imagine, what the name implies, which is simply content management. And we're going to structure the data in Sitecore, in this case, the same way we usually would, which is data templates and so forth. That all happens just the same way we think it does when we talk about a headless arrangement. But in a headless application, we're going to present the data, or we're going to handle our presentation on other platforms, that are appropriate for whatever the application is. And so we say, well, why does this matter? Why do we care? Sometimes different presentation technology is useful for different consumers. And we're going to talk a little bit in a minute about where and how we might consume this. But for now, you can think about this as using different technology in each different channel, where that's appropriate. So, and by channel, I don't necessarily mean into your actual different consumers. I mean into your entirely different channels. So if you're in an organization that's thinking about things like highly interactive portals, or like highly interactive configure and price quote type tools, or finder and locator type tools, you might find that it's easier to do those things in a modern technology framework than it is to do it, a modern front-end framework than it is to do it in Sitecore's presentation tools. Some of you may have tried to merge those things together in the past, trying to introduce Angular or React, let's say, into a Sitecore presentation environment with whatever success you've had. Some of you may be building for platforms like watches or platforms like apps. Some of you may be exploring things like VR or augmented reality right now, other Internet of Things type of applications. We're going to find that those are all interesting applications where a headless CMS may serve us. Something where we still want enterprise-grade content management, and we still want some of the other features that the CMS may provide us. In Sitecore's case, things like analytics and personalization and testing and so forth. But we may want to apply it across different channels. So let's take a look at a little bit of terminology, or dive a little further into the terminology here on the next slide. And I want to cut a distinction here between a headless CMS and a decoupled CMS. This is a concept, a diagram I stole from another spot on the web. But I thought did a very good job of explaining the difference between an API-linked front end and an actual headless CMS arrangement. And Sitecore is going to let us actually run both. it's going to let us run both and handle both in our deployments. The headless CMS on the left-hand side is what we're going to look at. Well, we're going to focus on today as we look at JSS. We're going to take a look at how we use our backend UI on Sitecore, along with Sitecore's API layer, to consume that content and create new presentation targeted towards each device. And that's going to allow us to run perhaps completely separate technology stacks in each of those channels like that. That's really a JSS application. You see that in the left-hand column of this presentation. On the right-hand side, that decoupled CMS column is more of an API linked implementation. And we can, of course, do the same thing with Sitecore by using the RESTful API that already exists for us. But you can see a somewhat different implementation here. In particular, the fact that JSS is going to allow us to host and manage those stacks in different places, whereas in a decoupled arrangement, we're going to have to pull it straight from the device. So I want to get the terminology out of the way. When we talk about headless CMS and we look at the portion of JSS I want to look at today, we're going to be talking about a headless type of arrangement where we actually have a web server with its own front-end stack running against Sitecore and serving whatever channel it is we feel like we want to serve. Okay, jumping forward, and I touched on this just a little bit ago. Why do we want to do this? Why do we care about a headless arrangement? And the first point is what I focused on already. Different channels do require different presentations sometimes, and so the ones that are most often cited, in the media or in the web discussions are things like Internet of Things and augmented reality. And you can see that those are maybe even though a lot of you probably aren't down an augmented reality road yet, and may not even be during this this product life cycle that you've got in-house. And they're the easiest place to conceptualize why headless makes sense. If I'm going to run an augmented reality device, my presentation is going to be substantially different than what I'll do to present on the web. And in doing that, I'm going to need to use different tools, different frameworks, and basically be unconstrained from the CMS's own presentation layer. So if you think about that, think about how you might build for a set of goggles or how you might build for a watch, then you can start to back into how this might also pay dividends for us if we're trying to syndicate content across different channels, or if I'm trying to support, let's say, native apps on mobile or on tablets and so forth. Or perhaps if I just have a highly interactive experience, perhaps what I want to do is just be unconstrained from some of the layout paradigms in Sitecore. Or maybe I just want to pick and choose which of Sitecore's layout paradigms I want to use, and I want to pull those in. Again, a headless arrangement, or JSS in particular, is going to be a nice way to solve some of those issues. In general, this is going to give us a physical separation now, not just a conceptual separation, but a physical separation of content and presentation. And that's going to allow us for rapid iteration as we go through our design or experience, as we try to refine just the experience piece to our deployment. For some of you, the shift in development skill set that happens here may be important, so I want to touch on that. Right now, with Sitecore as it is today, and a lot of your projects, you probably find participation of back-end developers, of .NET developers, in a number of presentation exercises. In shops, what we found is that in some customers, some shops that are heavily front-end driven, maybe with a large front-end staff, or with that maintain a lot of newsletter content or a lot of campaign sites and so forth, there may be skills to continue to build upon the CMS that right now are blocked because we require a .NET skill set in there to help facilitate that or deploy that. And one thing you can find with a JSS deployment is that it can be better empowering to those types of shops. So that shift in development skill set to put more or even all of the burden on the front-end developers can be useful. The other reason, another thing we found with headless type of architectures is that it can be faster to consume external services, especially ones that are already tuned for RESTful consumption, or ones that even have adapters or code or examples provided in React or in Angular. Those things can be faster and easier to consume externally. So when we're talking about or even a microservice type arrangement, let's say, we find that putting a headless architecture in can really facilitate productivity and even reliability of that type of design. So lots of reasons to go forward with it, and I promise we're going to get to some code here in a minute, but we got to lay a little bit of groundwork. Additional benefits: deployment flexibility. We'll talk about that in a minute. Having things decoupled off of Sitecore like that provides us some ability to put parts of the ecosystem in different places and to secure them differently. So we do have the potential of securing a headless arrangement in different ways than we would for securing a Sitecore site, a native Sitecore site as it is. Also, given that we're shifting over to some of the functionality over to Node, which we'll talk about in a minute, and Node runs very happily on very inexpensive servers, we may find that for some deployments, there's a potential to reduce hosting costs, if not actually licensing costs. All right, so what's involved to make this happen? So first and foremost, we're going to need a JSS-enabled license. Some of you may have that already, some of you don't. If you're on a subscription arrangement with Sitecore, especially a new subscription arrangement, you probably do have that. If you don't, if you have an older on-premise license, you probably don't have this. So your ability to work with JSS may be constrained by that. This would be a discussion to have with your Sitecore rep, and certainly we're happy to help facilitate that if you need to know where to call or how to do that. But you will need a JSS license. You will need an installation of Node.js, and for you developers, that's going to be on your workstation as you put this together. And Sitecore does publish a getting started guide that does a pretty good job of walking you through getting the tool set up. The third piece you need is a Node package, which is called Sitecore JSS CLI package. And that's going to work very much like other Node CLI packages where we can type commands and there are some generators and scaffolding that it can emit for you that'll let you open up that project and get started. By default, that thing actually emits a fairly robust sample application. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a kitchen sink app. It's got a lot of pieces doing a lot of different things, and for the purposes of what we're going to see today, I've stripped some of that down just to make it a little bit clearer. But it is a good read, so to speak, even if it does take some time to dig through and see how they've structured everything up. But that npm package really is your main entry point here into what you're doing. And then finally, there's a set of server-side components. Sitecore calls it JSS server components. You can get those off of the Sitecore site, and you'll need to install those into your Sitecore installation. I guess the one thing I didn't put here for a bullet point is you also need an installation of Sitecore eventually. We'll talk about what that means. Okay, so what are the pieces and parts here that we're going to talk about? So Sitecore kind of lays this out into 4 buckets. Any of you who've looked at this or have been browsing around the documentation have seen this diagram that shows up in a couple of places. JSS library is the first thing they refer to. That's that npm package, that Node package that we saw a minute ago, which really is the client-side bridge piece. That's all the bridge glue and the pieces that it generates and so forth. There's something called the Sitecore layout service. We're going to get into that a little deeper in a little bit. That's really what allows us to use, to the extent that we want to use Sitecore's rendering, its placeholder composition mechanisms, and consume the results of that over in our front-end application, in our headless application. That can be useful in some use cases, some architectures, especially if I want to enable, let's say, Experience Editor, or if I want to bring in a number of the features that Sitecore offers into my JavaScript application. That would include things like personalization or things like analytics and tracking. I'm going to need the Sitecore layout service to play a role in that for me. This is not something you have to worry about installing. This is a piece that exists already. It actually is exposed through the RESTful API you can consume. In other cases, this thing may not be as valuable. It does produce a fairly heavy set of JSON that describes the layout of a page. And we can opt to use some of that, all of it, or none of it as we build out our JavaScript applications. The third piece to talk about here is the server-side JavaScript rendering. This is literally what it says, server-side JavaScript rendering, where the requests that come through Sitecore can run through a localized, a captive node instance that Sitecore has running there that will process a page and render it and then inline it into a placeholder, as a rendering itself into a placeholder on a Sitecore page. This thing enables a couple of different parts of this framework. We're going to talk about them. It enables something called integrated mode for Sitecore, and it enables something called, it also enables a mixed mode type behavior where I can actually render some JavaScript application, some JSS application alongside or inside of some traditional Sitecore renderings. The use cases for some of that is not entirely clear to me yet, but it is an important piece, at least when I'm in development, to keep my development workflow sane. And the final piece here that we're going to talk about as we go through this is the application import. And I'm certainly not going to hit these in order, but these are going to be peppered throughout this discussion today. Application import, which is more or less a kind of an ORM style tool where I can sort of like an ORM code first style tool where I can actually code up the pieces that I want in Sitecore, and then as I deploy that, deploy is the word they use, as I deploy that application back into Sitecore, it will build out the Sitecore artifacts for me. We'll see kind of how that works and where we go and do that. If you dive further into the Sitecore documentation, you're going to get to some more involved diagrams, things that look like this. And some of these I think start to get a little bit less useful. One thing that JSS generally is a tool, in my opinion, that Sitecore has done right. Every now and then you get, well, more often than that even, you get things out of Sitecore, you look at it and say, wow, somebody really smart built that. And that's been my impression of JSS so far. It's a really well done piece that considers a whole lot of use cases. The downside of that is it considers a whole lot of use cases. And so as you sort through JSS and you start to consume some of this documentation and you see what's in there, you're going to find and have to make some judgments on whether some of these use cases really make any sense for the app you're considering building or for the technologies you have in place already. So I won't say to ignore the diagrams that look like this, but I will say they can be a little bit confusing and confounding to the really the simple concept we're dealing with here, which is I want to keep the content in Sitecore and I want to render it out elsewhere with other tools, right? So we're going to skip over this. I'm not going to talk through it, but you can see all the pieces here that we just talked about. There's Node and the view engine and the layout service and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's talk about what this looks like as we actually go to production. This is going to be fairly simple view of what we're dealing with. There's three of these, okay? When we go to production, your pages can be rendered by Node, your pages can be rendered by Sitecore, or you can build static pages, okay? So as you start to kind of discard all those words I gave you about the last few slides about what this thing is and what it isn't and how it goes together, you can basically start to focus your brain here, right? Do I want my pages rendered out by Node via React or via Angular or via Vue? Do I want my pages rendered by Sitecore, maybe with some inclusion of some of those frameworks and pieces? Or do I just want to write pages that consume stuff off of Sitecore? If we're in headless mode, true headless mode, the flow is going to look something like this. Sitecore's got that content, as we said, in the red box on the left. Node is going to handle serving our presentation in the middle, and the browser is ultimately going to consume that, and we're going to iterate back and forth with Sitecore to get our data. That's a sorry about that. Just reading a question that came in. That's the most basic way to visualize this. In a headless mode, a true headless deployment, your production deployment is most likely going to look something like this. I apologize if there's audio problems. I'm seeing that come through a couple of times. Hopefully I'm clear now. I'll try to keep this microphone in front of me and not move so much. Okay. So your headless mode deployment, your production deployment, your final real deployment is likely to look something like this. Alternatives as we go, in certain mixed mode cases, what they call integrated mode might be of some use, okay? An integrated mode is a server-side rendering, mode where Sitecore is going to take the request from the browser. It's going to pass off to its own node instance the pieces that need to be rendered, render them there, and then compose them inside of the rest of the Sitecore presentation framework before returning that page back to the browser. Integrated mode is probably not a great production mode. In fact, I think the Sitecore documentation at some point mentions this, that you better load test carefully if you're trying to do this. There are some good decisions they've made here. Each app does run an isolated node process. It does appear that it's something that could be tuned out to make it work in production, but generally this is probably not something I'm looking at except in some highly specialized type of deployments. You will be using this in development. In fact, the sites we see today are going to be rendered this way, integrated mode, for a number of dev workflow type reasons. Third option then, of course, not much of a flow chart, but that's API mode, right? Got Sitecore, we go to the browser, and we call back to the RESTful API. Some of you have probably built things like this already without JSS at all through the item API. All right, so let's talk about those dev workflows, give a little sense to what we're about to see here in a minute with code. Like I said a minute ago, we've got really two options. One is code first, one is Sitecore first. In the code first arrangement, we're going to work in JavaScript. So we're going to start by, maybe we as a front-end developer, we're going to sit down, We're going to install the stack that we talked about a minute ago, our favorite front-end framework. Mine is React, by the way, so we're going to see React today. And if you're looking for Angular, you're going to have to look elsewhere because I've not been terribly successful with that thing in the past. But I know it's popular, so it's in there. We're going to sit down with our front-end framework. We're going to sit down with Node. We're going to go ahead and install those Sitecore client-side tool, CLI tools, and we're going to start to scaffold out our application, right? I can do this in JavaScript without needing any dependency on Sitecore at all. This is actually what they call development-only mode or disconnected mode, I think, where I literally can start to work. And I'm defining my my Sitecore assets as I go right there in my JavaScript. It'll work that way. And then when I'm ready to deploy, I take it and say, let's deploy this thing over to Sitecore because I've got my running instance here and it's got the JSS server-side components running. And I go ahead and deploy that thing over to Sitecore. And now I'm going to run either in what they call connected or integrated mode. Okay, but that's all a code first. That's all a code first type of arrangement. The alternative is Sitecore first, which as a Sitecore developer was my initial option. I thought, or my initial inclination. I thought, well, code first sounds hokey, probably doesn't work right. I'm going to want to go to Sitecore first. So I'm going to go into Sitecore. I'm going to build out modeling structure because hey, that's what I'm used to and I know how to do that. So I'm going to build out a structure. I'm going to model this thing up, and then I'll consume them from JavaScript. Probably the best advice I can give you, and if there's one thing you take away from this, don't try it. Don't bother with it. Don't start there. JSS, if nothing else, is a little bit opinionated about where things live and how they structure up. And as appealing as this sounds to me as a Sitecore developer and probably to you as a Sitecore developer, this is more effort than it's worth. JSS will do, in its code first arrangement, sensible things. They're opinionated, but they're sensible. It will build your site out. It will move some of your sample content over, and it will allow you to iterate on that from JavaScript back into Sitecore until you're actually set with it, and then you can finalize that deployment and go about doing the work in Sitecore. So I highly recommend you start with a code first deployment. We'll take a look at what those assets are and how they're created and so forth. Click on through here. We did talk about some of these development configurations already. Like I said, disconnected mode is where we're generally going to start. That is working just as a front-end developer with no Sitecore involved. Connected mode is probably the most useful from a development standpoint, and that's where you're going to spend a lot of your time, where we're rendering our pages out of the local node instance and pulling content from Sitecore. Integrated mode, again, is the one we looked at integrated mode earlier. That's Sitecore side, server side rendering, makes sense in some specialized cases. And then there's API only, which would just be Node, either pulling straight from the API with only data or pulling straight from the API with just composed pages. We're not going to touch on that. We're not going to get into really those last two. We're not going to get into today because I think the applications are fewer than the ones we're looking at now. All right, and I mentioned a minute ago, client frameworks, React, React Native, Angular, and Vue are our options here. Everything you see today is going to be in React, and that's mainly just because of my comfort. It's not really a judgment as to which of these work best. To be honest, I don't really have the skills to go through the other two and attempt to compare them or validate them. So those of you who are Angular developers or Vue developers, you're on your own. You can send me an email if you think I can help, but my strength is going to be on the React side of things. All right, so before we jump into rendering modes and other things, let's take a look at what we've done here. Let's take a look at the basics. So over here in this window, you can see I've got Node running. You can see NPM. I've issued this command here. I've issued a command here that is JSS start connected. As I promised, we're going to work in connected mode. And my local Node instance is going to go ahead and spin this up and start to run the server on my local machine. The Sitecore is also installed locally for the purposes of this demo, but in reality can really be installed anywhere out on a dev server or anything else. The JSS command line tools here are going to do a number of things for me. You can actually see them as they're coming up on the screen since it's going slowly while I've got this webinar running. But one of the most important things it's going to do for me is it's going to actually do it's going to actually watch the directories. You can see the start watch components line there in the middle. It's actually going to watch the files. So once I've got this running and I'm in connected mode like this, I can make changes on the Sitecore side. I can make changes on the code side and my browser, my local browser, and npm will refresh. In fact, you can see it kicking it up right now. So we are sort of in a linked mode here, where I can make edits and see those changes fluidly without having to do deploys over and over again or reloads or anything like that. This, by the way, is the site that we're looking at the code. This is an extraordinarily simple manifestation of a store finder for a fictional Acme company. This is the thing that the code we're looking at is producing. It's really doing nothing other than pulling a list of locations out of Sitecore. You see those down the left-hand side, and rendering a Google map on the right-hand side to show me where those things are. Right. So nothing, no real trick here. The Google Maps is being done by a React Google Maps component, which of course, as we said, consuming other APIs is sometimes easier this way. Here you can see that's already componentized for us. But let's take a look at the code that's underlying this and some of the things that have happened here in our generation of this project in the first place, our scaffolding. I'm going to go over to Visual Studio and take a look. And this is, at the most basic level, what a JSS app looks like for you. If we take a look here in the data folder, I think I want to start here. We'll take a look at the content folder, stores. Initially here, when I started this project, this is where I began by kind of scaffolding out what I wanted to consume. I knew that I was going to do a store locator, so I started off by creating myself some store entries, and they're all entirely fictional, obviously. As you look down through here, each one of these folders is defining a Sitecore item, and the YML inside here is actually showing me is actually defining for me a particular item. When I did publish this thing into Sitecore, all of this data was pulled up and was dropped into Sitecore. Let's take a look at that over in the content editor, and we'll see here my stores application that I've created, which was created for me by the JSS scaffolding. And if I go here to content stores, you can see, lo and behold, those folders have reflected here. And Gator Industrial Services is a fully modeled Sitecore item, title, address, nonsense, summary, latitude, and longitude. And you can see, of course, that's exactly pulled out of here. We aren't free of data templates. We wouldn't want to be free of data templates. And these files here are I've told it to rely on a template called stores store item template. And if we take a look, we'll find that over here in my Sitecore templates store item template file. And right here, again, in JavaScript, I've defined what that template looks like. So this may feel a little bit awkward going from JavaScript just to define the Sitecore items, but what this does allow me to do is, even without Sitecore right now, it allows me to go through and run this, even when it didn't have Sitecore installed, it allows me to go through and run this in that disconnected mode. And so we've got questions popping up already. Let's see what we've got here. Yeah, a question popping in here. Do I have an example of a rich text field? I do not have an example of a rich text field right now. We can talk about that when I get to the questions part. Let's bring that back up, and we'll talk a little bit about how we deal with some of the more advanced field types in Sitecore. So at the moment in JSS. So at the moment we're only dealing with two very simple options: single line of text and a number. Suffice to say, for the purposes of what we're looking at right now, if we were dealing with a rich text field, we would model that here with common field types dot. I can show you we've got IntelliSense here. We do have our multi-line text box here. How we deal with that on the client side is another story, but if I was going to actually define it here, I'd define it right out of this list. So we'll put that back to number where it was. Because if I save this, it is going to refresh and try to do it for me. Okay, so once again, in JavaScript, I've defined my template. I've defined my data up here in this stores node in these YML files. And if I flip over here to Sitecore, I can see, once again, the data up here. And if I go down to my templates, under project, stores, here is my data template. Again, just as I defined it. Once again, worth saying, all of this was created for me in a vanilla copy of Sitecore when I deployed the JSS app back into Sitecore. Before that, I was working in disconnected mode. Okay, let's take a look. Other things that are interesting here. So if that's the data and the content I've put in there and the modeling for this, let's take a look at the routes. So I do have to define essentially what the pages are going to be, what the routes are going to be to my into my JSS app. And I've done that here under the routes, the data routes folder. Take a look at routes finder, and we'll look at this file here. Once again, it sort of uses the same paradigm that the content does. The folder itself is going to be the item, and then the file underneath it describes what that item is going to be. And in this case, I've defined just a single route here, which is to a page called Finder. And you can see when we look back at the browser, we are at localhost Finder, which is what we expected to be at. I've defined Finder. I've given an ID so I can deal with it. And then I've said that, hey, this page has a single field called page title on it, and then it's got placeholders. And so very much the composition of the page looks much like what I'll do in Sitecore under presentation details, except now I'm doing it over here in JavaScript. So I've defined a placeholder called JSS main. Well, I've referenced a placeholder called JSS main. I've stuck a component in there called stores, and I've applied a field to that component called heading, which has the text store list in it. I don't think I actually displayed that on the screen, so I apologize for that. But that's kind of how I modeled out the route to the Finder page. And if I look over at Sitecore, and we take a look at our content editor again, let's scroll up and take a look at what it's created for me. Stores here again is the app. I take a look at the structure. There's my Finder route right there. And if I look at Finder, sure enough, there's the page title, the JSS store Finder thing I said. If I look at components down here, you can see that it has created that stores component for me with the text of store list in the heading. So once again, code first, and JSS has built this out for me. If you try to build this by hand, if you have something like this to reference, you can build this by hand. If you try to build this in another structure, JSS gets kind of picky or gets kind of upset about it. So once again, I recommend the code first option. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of how we scaffold this thing out, how we push it back over into Sitecore and make it work. Now the question is, how do we actually build something, right? So if I'm a React developer, how do I go in here and build something? So let me close our route, because that thing's defined for us. Let me close one of our data files here. Let's close the template, because that's basically all our data modeling stuff. My first challenge as I go in here and say, hey, I want to build a page. I want to build a page that looks like this, a very simple app like this. My first challenge is I got to get this data, right? I know that's got to come somewhere out of Sitecore, and I say, how do I get this? And this is really where we get into GraphQL. Some of you have used GraphQL, and I don't think we're going to have, I know we're not going to have time on this call today to go through GraphQL really thoroughly. Suffice to say, it's the language that we're going to use to query items back out of Sitecore. If you haven't used it, it's the language we're going to use to query items back out of Sitecore and funnel them through this JSS framework as they come into my React app here. Sitecore includes for us a nifty browser. This is in your Sitecore installation that allows me to generate or to create my query on the left-hand side and to run it and see the results on the right-hand side. It does include some level of IntelliSense for me, so I can actually see what my options are here. There are plenty of references out there on this. The IntelliSense isn't bad, will help a little bit. But what I'm showing here is a pretty simple and fairly useful example of simply querying some items off of out of the nodes in Sitecore. So let's see if I can split screen here for you for a minute. Maybe this will help. Let's throw this on the left, and let's throw this on the right. See my query on the right-hand side. So what we've attempted to do here in this query is to go after the Sitecore content stores piece here, which is this list over here. And I apologize, my naming's not real good there. So I'm really going after this list of nodes here. And as I find them, I want to treat them as this store item template. That's the item template, the data template I've used to define them. And then I want to pull the title field. I want to pull the address. I want to pull the summary. I want to pull the latitude and longitude. And I want to label those things title field, address, summary, latitude, and longitude. Yes, there is a redundancy in title there, and that's really more an artifact of building a demo than anything else. There's not actually a point to that. So let's take a look now at how that manifests for us. You can see the intention is to pull this list of things on the left-hand side. And as we go back and take a look at the execution of this query, you can see that that's exactly what we've done here. You see a JSON output that is data, items, children, and in here are item by item with the fields I requested from it. Okay, and so this is ultimately what we're going to deal with on the React side now as that data comes back out of Sitecore. And I can build, like I said, there's references on GraphQL. You can deal with more complicated queries. You can do more work in this. You actually can extend the providers if you need to. But there's more work you can do on the left-hand side to get yourself an output that looks like we got on the right. But what's on the right here is actually what we're consuming in the application you see in my browser now, is JSON that looks like that. So back to our source code here. Let's see what we did with that. So as we go to build out the actual React application, I've got over here under source components. Now things start to look very React-like. Those of you who are React developers, we're now kind of out of the Sitecore domain and into the React domain. I'm building a regular React app, and you can see I've got the content block, which is a piece of that early scaffold that's just left there. I've got my Google components, which I built to actually put the map on the screen. And then I've got my stores component, which is essentially the rest of this thing. I didn't apply the most finesse to this ever because, again, it's a demo. But I basically built myself a component that has this list of things in it and the map. And this, for those of you who are React developers, looks very much like a React. It is a React app at this point. You can see my stores component, extends component, which we import from React, and then I go ahead and build up some click logic and some various other things here that make sense for the interaction we're going to have. You can see as we're in here that I'm dealing with, as I go to actually address the list of stores right here, I'm dealing with this thing I call store list. You can see here's where I actually iterate the stores down here. Dealing with this thing called store list, which I pull out of the props on the component. And props is a React paradigm. If you're not a React developer, you won't have something similar to this. But suffice to say, what I'm doing here is I'm running the query and then passing it into this component. And this is the mechanism React uses for that. Sitting alongside my actual React component here is this, let me find it here, is this component definition here. So this is the component definition that Sitecore is going to use as the Sitecore JSS framework is going to use in the manifest as it actually registers my component. And you can see here in this component definition, I have added in a file system read here on lines 5 through 8, where I read a GraphQL query, and then I tell JSS to go ahead and include that query in the rendering of this component. So you can see it's passed in here through GraphQL query, which has been loaded out of this file. And sure enough, if I go take a look at this file, we will see, lo and behold, the GraphQL query that looks very much like the one I just had in my editor up there in Sitecore, minus the duplicate title field for whatever reason I had that. So you can kind of see the wiring here. Manifest of my component, even if you're not a React person, you can get a flavor for what's happening here. The manifest for my component is here. The query, which is being loaded, is here, and that's being passed into the rendering of my React component via the props mechanism here. And once I have that come in, and JSS does that for me essentially. So the work I've had to do here was basically to write this GraphQL query to say these are the things I want, and then to consume those things as I build out my React component. You can see I've opted just simply to put these in a pretty basic table inside of some bootstrap divs. And I go ahead and iterate through that list of children, and as I do, I build table cells with IDs and so forth. And then I just wire up some quick click events that allows me to click through and focus the map. Fair enough. So basically what you can see here is the plumbing happening all the way from Sitecore, which is those components are not coming, they're no longer coming now from this content folder. They did when I was disconnected, but now that I'm integrated, they're coming straight through from Sitecore. They're flowing in through the JSS framework here using this query that I read here and defined here, and then displaying here in this React component. So that's a fairly straightforward implementation of a piping of data in from one side all the way through the other side. It is, as of right now, for the purposes of this demo and basically to keep this fairly straightforward, it is right now only displaying text. You know, those of you, again, who are Sitecore developers on this call will notice that the output of things like the title here is just simply showing child title value. And if you were doing this in a web form or an MVC, you know you need to decorate that to make it supported in the experience editor. The fact is that right now we have the same issue with this application as well. If I load this in experience editor, we can see that my component is here, my stores component, and it renders in experience editor. And actually I can still handle personalization and workflow and the other things I would expect to handle with this, but you can see that it is not entirely editable because we haven't decorated that. And actually we're not even using the layout surface at all. So let's run back here and take a look at a couple other concepts or review some of the things we talked about as we looked at that code. We take a look, layout service is the piece that we're just discussing. So the layout service is sort of the rest of Sitecore's rendering engine, sort of the rest of Sitecore's composition, page composition, which is available to me, not used in the demo you just saw, but is available to me as I go through and build up these pages. And what the layout service does essentially is renders to JSON instead of HTML, essentially. But by using that, I then get full support for the personalization, testing, experience editor, all of those sorts of things. And those are going to come right through the RESTful API, which is the layout render and the layout placeholder API calls. The difference between those being layout render essentially renders an entire page, and layout placeholder lets me go after just a portion of the page. But so as I were to build up a production app or a real app that I intended a customer to use, I'd want to rely on this layout service to not just to grab those data fields like I did there, but to actually grab them if I intended to be editable and I intended to support this type of functionality. Rather than just grab those values, I instead would want to call this service now and actually render out the editable pieces to those, or the presentation pieces to those components. So that's a layout service. Like I said, this may even warrant its own webinar at some point if we get enough interest in that, because it's another interesting topic, but it could be confounding, I think, in a presentation at this level right now. Another topic here, which I've sort of danced around, but I want to make sure that I touch it here as something that is available to us, and once again not shown in the code walkthrough we just went through, is what I refer to as mixed mode rendering. The Sitecore documentation refers to this as a number of different things. They refer to it as integrated mode sometimes. They refer to it as server-side rendering or SSR. Sometimes they refer to this as creating JavaScript views inside of Sitecore. They refer to a bunch of things, but essentially what's happening, what they're trying to depict here, is that there is an option where instead of having presentation led by in the headless mode, led in by the presentation framework like I just showed, instead they are offering you the ability to have your presentation led by .NET, led by Sitecore. Have it put that all together and then have it reach out and render any little pieces that you said are JavaScript rendered pieces. Have it render those in Node and then return that back in the response. Like we talked about earlier, the use cases are probably fewer than in a true headless deployment, but it is available to you if you want to use it and go down those roads. Again, with the caution that even Sitecore says, make sure you load test really well before you rely on Sitecore's Node rendering. I mean, I think it's worth saying, especially with the number of developers we got on this call, I think it's worth saying that you'd have to really be in a situation where you needed this before you'd want to use this. Because if we start to couple server-side rendering with Node into our Sitecore ecosystem, the requirements to scale that will start to get very complicated very quickly, as I need to scale out multiple Sitecore boxes, perhaps to control multiple Node instances and so forth. All right, data access, once again, we talked about GraphQL, and I guess I jumped the gun on my own slides, but there it is, we'll skip that. Okay, that brings me to where I hope to be, which is about 10 minutes to go, and time for questions. So it looks like our question mechanism is working. Hopefully my audio is working better now, but we did get some people firing some questions in so far. So given what you've seen, what questions do you have? What else can I show you? What else can we talk about? Go ahead and fire them through the question mode, and we'll see what we can do. I've got a hand raised. Let's see if I know how to do this. Unmute you maybe. Go ahead. Well, I think I have a hand raised. Nope, and they've dropped off. Other questions, other things we can show or go a little bit more deeply into? Question, will this recording be distributed after the webinar? Look to Lori, who's shaking her head at me. Yes, it is recorded. We will deploy this after, we will socialize this afterwards. Let's see. Another question comes in, says, is versioning of the app possible? So yes, is versioning of app possible? Yes, versioning is possible, largely because, at least in a true headless mode, yes, because the app is truly disconnected. What I can't do is I can't version the data store on the back side, because Sitecore is still a single data repository for me. So if I'm extending schemas or extending templates of data on the back side, I do need to still be careful that I'm not making breaking changes. But in terms of actually versioning the front end app, I can version that the way I would any other React app on the front, because I literally can deploy it into different versioned locations. But I'm not able to tell Sitecore that, hey, this set of data is versioned for release 1.2, and the next set of data is versioned for release 1.3. Okay, let's see the next one. How challenging is managing authentication state for users when rendering via third-party node-based framework? It's actually a great question, and it's one that I don't have a thorough answer to. It depends. I suppose the answer to this is it depends on how much you want to rely on Sitecore and the identity server. Generally, the concepts of it are going to be the same as any other app you would do on the front end, or with the front end framework you're using. One thing that is of note, though, is that Sitecore does with JSS. Kill my questions window here. When I take a look at the app that's coming through, Sitecore does, let's see if I can get this visible to you guys. Let's open the developer tools here. And if we take a look at the React build out, as you see it, as Sitecore does build it out, you do have access to the context here. And so the JSS tool is pulling some aspects of the Sitecore pre-render into the browser. So depending on how you want to implement the identity from the client back to the server, you do have the ability to pass some of that information down. So I guess to answer the question more precisely, how challenging is it? Challenging, but not super challenging, provided that you're comfortable with the identity services. Okay. Can you show the experience editor again and how that was integrated? Yes, I can, but it's not well integrated. So if I take a look here at the experience editor as it is, you can see that this is what we'd expect to see maybe in a poorly written Sitecore site. This is experience editor. All I've done here, by the way, is simply go into Sitecore and just navigate out to this path and go to the experience editor. So I've done nothing special here. This is literally out of the box what we can expect. And you can see that because of the way I structured this item as a component inside of a Sitecore placeholder, sure enough, I get a stores component inside of a placeholder here. And what's driving this is back here in the code, when we look at the routes, what's driving this here is that as I define this page, I define the placeholders, JSS main, which is, even as the comment says here, JSS main is sort of the root placeholder for me. I define this as a component named store. I defined the component named stores being placed inside of this placeholder. And you can see Sitecore is reflecting that for me right here. So I am actually working kind of in concert with page composition, even if I'm not in that pipeline right now. Let's see. Can JSS be used on an existing site? Michael Reed, yes, absolutely. It can be used on an existing site. It is going to get a little bit finicky. You're going to end up being a little bit more in the decoupled mode than you are in the true headless mode. But if you have an existing site, that's probably more or less what you intended anyway. Your GraphQL is going to work the same way. It's going to be a matter of making sure that you get where's my content editor? It's going to be a matter of making sure that you build the routes out correctly. If you don't want to do that, if you want to do it like I've done it here, you're going to need to build the routes out correctly. If not, you may be in a case where integrated mode makes a lot of sense. If you take a look in the Sitecore documentation and take a look at the integrated mode, what you'll see is you can write your JSS application and then actually expose it back to Sitecore as a Sitecore rendering. So it'll come back into Sitecore in your presentation details, just like another view would. And you can even set parameters on it as you add it in. The caution being that is the thing that's server-side rendering. So you've got a number of approaches. You can go after an integrated mode like that. You can go after sort of an API only or a decoupled mode, but either one will work in your existing site. Should we use GitHub with this? If so, how, what files? Yeah, good question. So we take a look at this. Yes, you should definitely use GitHub with this, with anything else. On the left-hand side here, as we look at this, the folder here that says .idea is because I use WebStorm a lot of times. That's what's creating that. Everything here in the data folder, everything here in the public folder, everything in the server folder, everything in the Sitecore folder, these are all parts of my solution here. So all of this would need to be source controlled, all the way down here to some of the manifest work and so forth that you see at the bottom. The only thing here that might not be would be these scripts which come in the scaffolding, which literally are the scripts that are starting the environment and tearing down the environment. But of course, if you start customizing those, you source control them also. So unlike your actual Sitecore instance where you've got folders full of Sitecore related stuff, other than what's in the node modules directory, all this can be source controlled. Can we use external data sources for JSS components? Yes, absolutely. One thing that I may not have impressed as heavily as I should have is that this index.js file here is legitimately a regular old React component. And so you can see the Google Maps thing sort of demonstrates it. But yes, I can consume anything from here that I would normally consume in a React application. So and it's really one of the benefits if I've got a landscape that has a number of those things. I can consume them. I can consume them in here the same way I would in any other sophisticated front end application. All right, let's see what else we've got here. Can we use other databases besides GraphQL? So yes. So once again, the same answer I just gave to the last question. As I go through GraphQL, my only backend obviously is Sitecore, or at least with this approach, my only backend is Sitecore. But with React here, I can use with React and Node, I can use any other data layer provider I want to in my Node stack. So if I've got a MySQL database or something else in the environment, perhaps I have a microservice built on that. I'm going to access it via an API. That's great. But perhaps I've got to go straight after the database. I can do that as well, the same way I would with another node-based React app. Now, one thing I have not experimented with is to what extent I can start to put routing frameworks over in Node. So what you may find here is that if you're trying to do this, you're going to have to go directly after the data providers and not try to put in frameworks like Express that are going to perhaps disrupt this. I haven't experimented with that in the past. It's probably configurable to make it work, but I don't see any reason to go that way. Okay, let's see here. Because this was a code-first headless implementation, does that mean it could have run fully in disconnected mode without any instance of Sitecore setup in the first place? Yes, absolutely. Great question. Yes. This app did run fully disconnected in the first place because it ran mostly disconnected because I hadn't finished it at that point. But yes, before I connected it, this app could run fully disconnected in the browser. And this really is what empowers us to have front-end developers get started on this, actually build these things out, rough these things out, even before the Sitecore app is in place, or before we decided to deploy it into a Sitecore development. I can do this work on the bench and then go into my test environment, let's say, and deploy it all at once, so that now we can test and review in there. So yes, thank you for the question, reiterating that, and I know somebody's listening, which is awesome. How does dynamic routing work? I mean, routing by item path. So I think the question here is more around things like wildcard routing in Sitecore. I guess I can't ask you, so I'm gonna have to assume that's what we mean. Truly, I don't know. I've not tried to work that scenario either. I suppose you're asking how do I create? I guess I'm not sure. I'm not certain about the question. I guess Kieran, if you want to shoot that in, kind of reword it, or if you want to pick it up afterwards, I'd be happy to try to answer that. I don't know if you're going after item detail or if you're going after single multi-purpose reuse component. I mean, generally speaking, if my goal then, I'm gonna take a stab at your question, and you can follow up with me if you want to. If our goal here is to, let's say, have a detail page on each one of these, right? On each one of these, then I'm simply going to handle that the same way I would with ID-based routing in any other React environment. I'm going to put ID-based pathing on this, and then I'm going to handle that with a single component on the back end. Okay, 301, and I think I've just reached the end of the questions. I apologize if I got any of those questions too fast. I was trying to make sure we got them all in. So if I left anything open or untied, you want to talk a little bit about other strategies, by all means, shoot them through to us. I think Lori will probably follow up with you, and we'll get questions answered. We should have a recording of this that we can distribute afterwards. I really appreciate the time all of you took to sit with me here on this today. Again, it's a feature that we're real excited about, seeing a lot of opportunity for it, starting implementations on it fairly recently, and anxious to see it out there in the ecosystem. So hopefully some of you got inspired in some way, shape, or form to use this in your environment. And with that, I guess I will let you all go. Thanks for attending.